You know, and thanks to all of the organizers, and especially Kevin and Matthew for the introduction and the invitation to come and talk to you today. Let's enable media. Here you go. I resisted coming up with the title for a while because I really had a hard time trying to frame what the right thing to say to this audience would be. And so, you know, perhaps it's best just to leave it as something that is to be announced, right? And I want to present some mildly provocative comments on what the future might bring for machine actionable chemical data, and why should we care to bother, right? And how can we convince other people to bother? And you know, the work that I'll tell you about today, I'll tell you a little bit about some of the things that we've been trying to do to show the value of machine actionable data and to make it work. And that work has been supported by these kind organizations. So, you know, I guess I wanted to start off just by saying that, you know, we sometimes take it for granted that our expectations of what a technology should do are shaped by the cultural milieu that we live within. You know, for example, I mean, let's think about ARPANET, right? You know, which was initially funded in 1966 and then came online in 1969. You know, really, this was focused around sort of the teletype model, right? This idea that computers were used primarily for number crunching, and, you know, any messaging that we would do or remote access, you know, was through, you know, sort of a telnet-like process, kind of like the old teletype machines that people were used to. And, you know, later on, right, this idea of file sharing comes about. But, you know, in many ways, this looks a lot like an office environment in the 1960s, right? You have things that look like typewriters, and they send messages, and you schlep files around in order to get them from one site to another. You know, no cat videos, no Usenet forums, et cetera. And so, you know, I think perhaps one of the challenges for us as a community is to think about how our expectations for machine actionable data are framed by the type of scientific culture that we live in now. Let me give you an example of this, right? You know, and I would say that actually the way that that's shaped is the sort of journal publication culture. Just a kind of a beautiful case study for this is the Protein Data Bank, right? Which was actually started in 1971. So really sort of early. The initial entries in the Protein Data Bank were 7 structures that were collected at Brookhaven National Laboratory. And what's amazing, and you know, actually this is something in a review article that I and some other folks from DOE have put together and should appear later, is that today, you know, if you actually try to assess the value of the research that went into the structures in the Protein Data Bank, there's something like $12 billion US worth of research funding necessary to generate those structures. And you know, there are estimates that the increase in research productivity annually from use of the Protein Data Bank is something on the order of $2.5 billion US annually, right? So really kind of amazing. And we've seen in the past year the way in which this kind of collected archive of structural information has served as training data for machine learning models, AlphaFold and RosettaFold, that are in some sense are perhaps very transformative for this field. But you know, in a way, the Protein Data Bank, while being this incredibly powerful and useful resource, looks a lot like doing things in a journal, right? You know, it's shaped around a research culture in which there's a cultural expectation that if you publish your structure in a journal, you must deposit the structure in PDB as a prerequisite for publication in a journal. So the journals kind of serve in a way, right, as a stick, right, to encourage people to deposit structures. And you know, the things that you deposit are a single final processed research result, right? The end of some long research journey. And so, you know, the question is then, like, what might alternatives look like? Another thing that I wanted to just kind of bring out as a thought is the evolution of supporting information, right? You know, in the old days of paper journals, you know, you see lots of allusions to results, right? just take my word for it that we collected a spectrum on this thing, and it is as described. And what happened in the early 2000s, as there was this shift to electronic journals, was that there was this new format, right, or this new sort of resource of electronic supporting information. And generally, these were PDF files that included some supporting plots or spectra. And I remember them being really kind of generally very brief, right? Just a few plots. Nowadays, oftentimes the supporting information files are longer than the actual manuscript or the main paper. There's a way in which they're stuck, right? I mean, there's still mostly static information about a limited subset of the experiments. And what we've seen, particularly for computational work and increasingly in sort of the machine learning for chemistry field, is more use and sharing of data and code. This is often in external repositories. So there's a way in which it's sort of indirectly connected to the paper in a sense. And that being said, we don't really see that type of data and code deposition for experimental work, or certainly we see much less of it. And so, one of the things that I've been working with a team of experimentalists on is trying to think about, like, well, what would a future look like, right? I mean, if we're generating and disseminating machine interpretable data, maybe there are better forms for doing this. And this is just sort of an example of some interactive browsers that we developed around exploring high throughput data that we had collected on perovskite crystal formation, with the goal of not just sharing our data, in some incomprehensible format, but also making it easy for people to sort of drill in interactive figures and actually see all of the results that we perform, the successes and the failures. And similarly, tagging those with sort of data representations in machine interpretable forms of spectroscopic data that we might collect. If you think about it, the experiments that we perform, and I'm going to approach this from the perspective of talking about synthetic materials chemistry. The experiments that we perform are inherently sort of a network of materials and the actions between them. And so, as Matthew had alluded to, we can think about trying to develop schemas for describing that sort of network of interactions and what are the observations that we make to particular materials or actions. And and also, as Matthew has alluded to, right, the types of things that constitute chemical evidence, are really diverse, right? They include, sort of models of the world and of atomistic processes. They include things that look like recipes. They include qualitative observations. They include spectroscopic information of lots of different types. And so, this really sort of presents a vast challenge for us if we want to make all of chemistry machine actionable. But let's carve out a small region of this and try to make a path towards it. Let's also, I think perhaps something that this workshop can do is to try to help the broader community imagine a future beyond a scientific culture that is focused on papers, right? And and I think that the emphasis on machine actionable data and the representations of the intent of experiments, what the process is and how it's performed, and the results, is perhaps a starting point towards that. There probably are models of doing open science that are beyond the discrete paper model. And I guess what I would like to also argue for is, there's value in small data, in incomplete data, and in noisy data, provided that we can aggregate it and that we have methods for working with that. If we were in a lecture hall, I would stand on the table right now and say metadata, right? Which I think is incredibly important. And I think everybody in this audience appreciates it. But I think we need to kind of sell that more to the rest of the scientific community. And then, the emphasis on reusability as a metric for scientific success. I think that perhaps one of the things that we can try to be proponents of is, encouraging not just dumping a, PDF of a complete experimental result in a paper, but somehow, making sure that that data is reusable and useful for people later on. And all of this may entail new types of ways of assigning credit and publication models. I don't know if we're going to solve that in this conference, but perhaps there's sort of room to think about that. So, I want to get back to this idea of demonstrating value, because I don't think anybody is going to adopt these methods unless we show them how they can do science better. And so, we have to show the value of improved data capture and sharing. And the way that we can do that is by showing how it enables us to build better models of the world that in turn allow us to make scientific predictions, how it improves reproducibility of scientific results, and maybe how it allows us to discover interesting things. And so I wanted to kind of walk you through some of the ways that my community of practice of experimental synthetic materials chemistry has been trying to demonstrate this, and also realizing that your community of practice in X-ray spectroscopy or other spectroscopies, will have its own flavor of how this will work. So why should chemists bother with this stuff? Well, as Matthew alluded to, I mean, one of the way that I got into this was thinking about, could we use reaction data to try to predict the success or failure of new exploratory syntheses? And, the thing that we found was that it's not fundamentally hard, but what you need is a complete data record, right? A record of not only the experimental successes that we publish in journals, but also the marginal successes and the failures, right? And so, that data is sort of largely missing. Way back in 2015 or so, what we did was we just paid a bunch of undergraduate students to go through and transcribe lab notebooks. And we transcribed a decade's worth of laboratory notebooks, and then built some very, very basic machine learning models and showed that those were actually pretty good, right? Maybe even comparable to or better than the human experts that we had when we tested these things in the laboratory. And so, really the missing piece was not the data science, which in some sense is actually pretty easy, but it's access to that sort of unpublished or dark data, so to speak. And once you do this, I mean, not only do you have a tool that can help you do reactions more efficiently and get to successes more efficiently, but maybe even ways to kind of like peer through that data and try to extract new hypotheses. The other thing that we have once we have this complete collection of data is maybe a way of identifying the types of cognitive blind spots that humans have, or as I like to say, humans just like to get stuck in a rut, right? And so as sort of a follow-on to this work, one of the things that we did was we looked at a combination both of public data in the Cambridge Structure Database, right, comprehensive data resource, of the types of reagents that people use in these templated metal oxide syntheses. We also looked at this archive of unpublished laboratory notebooks and looked at the reaction conditions that people used. And the thing that we found was that both the kind of reagent choices and reaction conditions tended to be really sort of overrepresented in both data sets. And we really needed both in order to tell this story. And it looks like once you kind of have this complete view, you can actually see that maybe that popularity is uncorrelated to the reaction success rates, or the cost of the reagents or other types of technical considerations. And I guess knowing is half the battle here, right? And so by sort of having a complete record like this, you can sort of look back and see what mistakes you make. And this is actually maybe non-trivial, right? I mean, the thing that we found is that this type of kind of anthropogenic bias actually, in some sense, samples the space of experiments less efficiently, and maybe other kind of improved sampling methods could be a more efficient use of experimental time. And so, I guess I want to put these forward as case studies of ways that we can draw insight from complete records of what we do in the lab, and the types of complete records that aren't necessarily published. Okay, I think another thing that we often hear a lot about these days, and I'm guilty of banging on this drum as well, is the idea that maybe automation will solve all of our problems, right? And so we'll just have robots that do these things. And that's great because we have to tell the robot what to do in a digital format. So we'll record that. And then the outcomes of our automated synthesis or characterization, will also in some sense be digital data. And so, that will sort of solve all the problems. And I guess what I would argue to all of you is that it'll solve some of the problems, right? And I think certainly it'll help improve reproducibility and replicability, right? By making the barrier to a complete disclosure of the lab process a little simpler, simply because the intent or the experimental plan and the results are born digital. And that'll help in many ways, right? Give us this complete record of successes and so on, and maybe allow us to capture unimportant details. But I guess what I would argue is that it's not quite enough, right? And automation isn't going to solve all of our problems here automatically. I think we still need to pay very careful attention to the broader culture of how do we share data and make it interoperable. And then even in the laboratory setting, automation is not completely going to remove the need to capture human operator actions, right? Things like preparing stock solutions and so on. Moreover, I think it's sort of almost too obvious to state, right, that there's tons of legacy non-automated equipment that has unique capabilities. And this is going to require us to pay attention to ETL and so on to make use of that. And so, I mean, my expectation is, it's not like automation is just going to take over the world, right? I think what we'll see over the next decade are, islands of automation, so to speak, right? Places where, there's some rate limiting experimental process, and we'll have a gadget that just automates that process, but the things that come before or after, will still be kind of done in the business as usual type way. And so, I think that's going to require us, as we think about experimental capture, to kind of think about the interface, how you get to and from these islands of automation, and how do you make sure that data doesn't get lost in those transitions. And and I think also, I mean, it's easy to get distracted by robots and gadgets, and they're cool, but they're certainly not the whole story. So what about showing value, right? I want to just kind of walk through a few examples of things that we've done quickly. I mean, one is, if we collect this combination of historical data, maybe what we can do to show value to experimentalists is look for anomalies, right? Look for statistically significant differences that might give us a clue. And then, we can always kind of feed that back in to explore our chemical systems, right? And, part of this, I guess, for us was motivated by thinking about ways that we might apply ideas from quality engineering to scientific discovery, right? The typical ways that we think about, finding and removing defects in manufacturing often depends on having a preconceived notion of what a correct outcome is. And in scientific discovery, we don't always have that, but we can look for, in sort of an unsupervised way, kind of anomalies, right? And so, some of the things that we've done, again, just as kind of proof of concept, is, try to collect comprehensive data across thousands and thousands of reactions, and then see where you can kind of make statistically interesting observations, right? So for example, our reactions are performed on a kind of a heating block. On the left, you can see an infrared image of this. There's some kind of temperature gradient there, and what we can do is sort of pool the reaction together over tens of thousands of reactions and find statistically significant trends and deviations, right? Changes in crystallization outcome, that result from these small temperature variations, and even break it down into kind of particular groups of reagents that we use and so on. We might even think about kind of using this type of extreme data collection and metadata collection as a substitute for experimental controls, right? I mean, and as an example, things like laboratory humidity can be hard to control perfectly. And so we could invest a lot of effort in trying to dial that down or running everything inside of a glove box. Or alternatively, what we might do is just measure and record it, right? And consider those fluctuations as just sort of natural experiments. And so, in a paper that came out last year, we tried to show what this might look like. We took kind of our archive of 15,000 reactions, looked at fluctuations in the humidity, and then tried to find places where we had run similar reactions under conditions of low humidity and high humidity, and try to see where we found differences in sort of reaction outcome. And essentially, just applying some basic statistical models to kind of identify cases that looked anomalous and that were promising for subsequent work, right? And so, essentially, the idea here is to sort of automate the process of serendipitous discovery, right? To sort of use this comprehensive collection of data and metadata to find discrepancies in a big haystack of data, see where the most promising conditions were, and then follow them up with actually deliberate interventional experiments to try to confirm the effect. And indeed, actually, we found some kind of interesting chemistry, but in the interest of time, I won't go into that. Historical data maybe also serves another purpose as well, right? I mean, we can use this as a way to train machine learning methods, sort of based on historical data, to evaluate new methodologies before we invest a lot of work in testing them in the laboratory. And this slide is just way too busy, but the goal here was really to just kind of communicate an idea that historical data maybe serves as sort of a resource for testing and development on the path to deploying things in the laboratory. And that ultimately the things that we develop and use in the laboratory need not be automated. They could actually kind of be methods that are applicable at small scale. But we don't get there unless we collect that comprehensive data set. To kind of help facilitate this, I mean, we've been trying to develop some software that we call Escalate, with the goal of kind of doing all of the things in blue on this diagram. So providing an API for humans and algorithms to specify experiments, and then creating instructions for human operators or for different types of robots, and then archiving the experimental data and metadata that gets collected, sort of like an abstraction layer over the kind of immediate process that you use in the laboratory. And then sort of facilitating a kind of a rich collection of data by adding interpretive layers. We're actually on version 3 of this now. Version 2 was kind of dodgy. Version 1 and 2 were actually all kind of dodgy. They were really kind of meant for us to try to figure out what's going on. As of version 3, everything is sort of built on a relational database with a REST API for specifying what the materials are that you use, what are the properties and what are the actions that you perform for them, and then defining experiments in terms of this sort of material action type graph, and then pulling out results. And there's a tutorial on how you can drive it through the REST API, but we've also spent a lot of time making nice graphical user interfaces so that people can just kind of drag and drop actions and processes to describe what they want to occur, or kind of a general template of what an experiment should be, and then make specifications of individual experiments. So we're kind of running short on time. I want to end with a few provocative conversation starters, perhaps to help motivate some of the discussions that we'll have in the breakout. And the first of these is on adoption, right? What can we do to make the sort of rank and file experimental chemists adopt the types of machine actionable data that we want to develop in this conference? And I think what we have to do is just demonstrate that it's useful, right? And maybe this takes the form of a carrot, right? Like case studies like the ones that I've talked about, showing how this will make you a more productive scientist and help you discover things more quickly and with less labor. And we've actually tried to collect some data on that sort of workflow ergonomics to make cases like that. On the other hand, there's also a stick, right? I mean, we could also think about increasing the requirements by funders or by journals and their editors, or policies of national level user facilities to sort of encourage the types of data recording and data sharing in actionable ways that we would like to see. I think also kind of touching on something that Matthew had mentioned and the value of messy solutions, let's not be afraid of an 80% solution here, right? I mean, I think kind of the biggest barrier is the technology activation barrier for new users to adopt these things. After we started work on the Dark Reactions project, we developed, just kind of a basic CRUD app to try to collect these things. And PIs are always very enthusiastic about this, but the graduate students, it just seemed like too much work. And so what we've tried to focus on is just making this easier for people to use. And I guess what I would argue to all of you is that perhaps just making things easy, even if it isn't a complete solution, might be more meaningful overall. I think the other thing too is asking ourselves what types of technologies a single user might adopt that creates value for that single user, as opposed to sort of requiring that the entire community of adopters exist on day one. And I think certainly the sort of use of data mining and machine learning type tools to try to learn from your data and plan better experiments might be one example of something that can be useful for a single user. And maybe that's the hook, but perhaps there are others as well. It's possible that maybe you could accomplish this with just kind of lightweight overlays on top of existing tools that people use, sort of like guardrails on top of the Excel spreadsheets and Google Sheets and things like this that people use. Maybe that's an option, right? But I think anything that we can do to make the kind of painful and difficult tasks easier might be a way to attract users to the technologies that we're developing. Automation, right? I mean, I think on the one hand, automation is great, right? I think there's a real opportunity, particularly for spectroscopy, to think about this as, really being kind of a natural place where what you want the spectrometer to do comes in as kind of a digital set of instructions and can be stored. And then what the results are also digital data, right? And so both the experiment plan and the results are born digital. And that's great, right? I mean, it seems like it allows us to capture the results and doesn't kind of require a lot of effort on the part of the user in principle. At the same time, maybe automation is overrated. And I think we want to think carefully about kind of the islands of automation that exist and how we might use individual pieces of automated equipment, or how we can still kind of continue to collect data from valuable legacy equipment. I guess maybe a kind of a bigger problem, but perhaps for a different audience, is just this idea that like early stage experimentation is often very fiddly and maybe not well suited to automation or other types of things. And I intend that as just kind of a provocative statement, right? But I think whatever we develop should also help in a non-automated scientific lab. And then finally, perhaps a conversation starter on education, right? I'm not sure if I believe this, but I'll make the claim, right? Perhaps it's easier to teach a chemist squeal or insert technology here than to teach a programmer about chemistry. And perhaps there's also a way in which we can think about the types of machine actionable data management and kind of fair processing as an extension of the things that we already teach in our undergraduate laboratories about laboratory notebook skills. And in fact, actually, I mean, my opinion is that the best way that we can move the entire scientific community forward is to find ways to incorporate the things that we're doing in this workshop into the existing pedagogical lab experiences that students do in the undergraduate curriculum. So, can we sort of imagine developing a version of X-ray spectroscopy interpretation that could just be popped into a physical chemistry laboratory, or ways to think about keeping improved electronic data notebooks in your undergraduate lab and sharing those as part of the deliverable. Maybe this looks like kind of software carpentry type models of training. And I guess here too, I would say even small things will boost the general awareness of the population. I mean, we're planting seeds in the scientists of tomorrow so that they're at least aware of the need to kind of organize their data in this way. And perhaps it's just enough that they care about issues like these and can have an intelligent conversation with software engineers who will implement this. And maybe just to kind of show you an example of what this might look like. I had a master's student, Sophia, shown at the top right-hand side, that helped develop and then test with us in a physical chemistry teaching lab a kind of a new activity on machine learning-based interpretation of IR spectroscopy. And so, this is really designed to be something that you could drop in to your existing lab experience, even an organic chemistry laboratory, and with sort of a guided sequence of exercises to just get students thinking about, how do you handle spectroscopic data? How do you prepare and normalize it? How do you build some sort of basic machine classifiers? And what are sort of the common problems that you might experience in scientific data? And so, we've tested this on students at 2 schools, and you can read about it in JChem Ed. Again, I think it would be really neat for one of the outcomes in this workshop to be taking a version of the work that you're doing and perhaps presenting it in a format like this. And I think we'd certainly be interested in testing it on our students. Finally, a shameless plug here. I'm an associate editor at a new Royal Society of Chemistry journal, Digital Discovery, which is an open access journal, free to read and free to publish through 2024. Digital Discovery is really aimed at promoting the types of conversations that I think we're going to have over the course of this workshop, with an emphasis on data and its role in chemistry. In fact, to state that even more strongly, of the 3 reviewers that we have reading papers, one of them is dedicated to analyzing the data and source code that must be provided for publication and making sure that it is actually usable and does the things that it says. And having discussed this with the other associate editors, Digital Discovery would very much welcome a submission of the final report from this workshop as a perspective article. So if you'd like to consider that, we'd be very open to that. And furthermore, of all of the individual projects that we're going to hear about today, Digital Discovery would also like to extend a warm welcome and encourage you to submit your research papers there. So I think with that, I'm going to stop so that we can end things on time. Hopefully, I haven't been too provocative, and this foray into experimental synthetic chemistry has not been too much of a distraction from the main topics of the work. But with that, I'll stop, and I'll be happy to take any questions now or offline as well. Thanks a lot.